Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, with the new meta with Snake Eyes being everywhere in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, I figured I would give you a rundown of what the best cards would be for non-engine in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. So, things that are going to help you fill out your deck outside of the standard engine, right? We have a few tiers here. We have best in slot, these are going to be things that you are likely going to want to play if you can, or just like overall have the best use. We have strong options, which are just options that are available to you that can be played and that are going to be overall useful. We have good with low tech or low space for tech or non-engine. So this basically is a tier specifically designed for decks that maybe want to run more engine or have very little space for non-engine. So something like Runic, for example, where the Runic spells and the Runic spells are basically your non-engine, right? Your interactions. So instead of that, you utilize maybe a few other cards. So stuff like that. And then we have mid and bad. Let's start off here. Let's just talk about the meta real quick. If you haven't seen my other tier list video for ranked climbing, this is obviously going to be similar for that as well. So best of one, for ranked, for climbing, etc. But if you haven't seen that, the two best decks are, at least for climbing, are Snake Eyes and Labyrinth. However, I do believe you really do need to be prepared for specifically Snake Eyes, and with that, it means hand traps are going to be a lot better. So hand traps are going to have higher spots, and things like board breakers are going to be a bit weaker, just in the current metagame. That's just how this kind of works right now. Hand traps are really strong right now, so that's going to be what's going on. Starting off with Dark Hole. Dark Hole is just bad. There are very few decks that are really going to want to utilize specifically Dark Hole, as opposed to something like Raigeki or Lightning Storm or Evenly Matched or what have you. So it's fine, it's okay. It's another like board wipe if you want it, but honestly it's pretty bad right now. Next up we have Triple Tack. Triple Tack is a strong option. The thing is, it's not great because it is specifically a board breaker. It's not another hand trap, but it's very good into the Snake Eyes board. So if you're specifically utilizing, for example, you don't have lots of options for hand traps, like you can't run a lot of hand traps, like 12 to 15 or even 20, right? Then it's probably a better option to run something like a few hand traps and Triple Tack to get as much advantage as you possibly can. So something like Triple Tack is still very strong. It's just not the best right now. Next up we have Kurikara. Kurikara is kind of mid. There are a few decks that utilize it, and it's okay because of like Snake Eyes being able to kind of play into that and being able to be searched with Snake Eyes. The problem is that with this card, it's rather slow, and while yes, you technically can deal with opponent's boards and stuff like that, it does require you to specifically use it going second, which means that going first, it's not nearly as useful. Which is what mostly makes it not as viable. It's really good in it's decently good in Snake Eyes as an additional search target, but I feel like it's just better to run like Jet Synchron, which actually does something. So yeah, I think it's kind of mid. It is very strong if it does resolve, but other than that, it's not great. Maybe if you're playing more of like a board breaker centric build, sure, it's okay, but it's not great. Next up, we have Summon Limit. Summon Limit is honestly really good. If you are going to play a deck that can play around Summon Limit, it's probably pretty worth it. Lots of decks play into this very, very well. Or not very well, but like have issue with it, so it's pretty strong. DD Crow is pretty mid. I think there are a few corner cases where it could be good. Being able to hit like Super Heavy Samurai to like banish a card from their grave is fairly decent as well. Super Heavy Samurai is pretty popular as well, so that's another thing. Being able to hit like a Flomberg or an Ash or something like that, a Poplar, whatever's in the grave. There are a few things for it to be useful with. Also notably, it is not a fire, which is pretty nice, unlike something like Ash Blossom. Spellbound's just not good. Daruma Karma Cannon is also... So I'm going to put it here right next to Triple Tactics Thrust. So if you are going to utilize Triple Tactics Thrust as potential engine, right, for example, in Branded or something like that, Daruma Karma Cannon might be something that's worthwhile because of the fact that it's pretty good with dealing with, like, link monsters, which is what a lot of Snake Eyes is. So being able to deal with that with just, a single card is pretty impactful. However, it's only really going to be used with the Triple Tactics Thrust, so it's still a good option, especially for going first and being able to just, like, shut down the opponent, but do keep in mind it's probably not great outside of that context. Next up, we have Evenly Matched. I'm going to put in the same slot, and the reason for this is because Evenly Matched is pretty decent right now. There aren't really a whole lot of Omni Negates and stuff like that, and being able to wipe a board is very strong, even if it loses you the battle phase. But the problem is, again, hand traps are going to be a lot stronger. So if you don't have space for a lot of hand traps or options like that, yes, Evenly Matched is going to be one of your best options. However, if you have space for the hand traps, play the hand traps. It's just going to be better for you to stop the opponent from playing, from stopping them from getting cards into the grave, or anything like that, right? Because a lot of times they'll have additional follow-up with the Snake Eyes stuff, or with a myriad of other decks as well. So it's just not really worth it to waste an Evenly Matched if that could instead be 3 other hand traps. Next up, we have a Droplet. Droplet's just bad right now. I don't really see any use for it. The cards there aren't really any decks besides, like, maybe Super Heavy Samurai who you would want to like negate a board. But even against Super Heavy Samurai, you're better off playing, again, hand traps, or there are just, like, better options. There's one exception, I think. There's, like, one deck I think that realistically could still be playing Droplet, and that's Tri-Brigade. Maybe a few others, but it's hard to really say. I feel like for the most part, this is not a great card. Same with the Bestials. Yeah, the Bestials are just not great right now. Fire. That's it. Yeah. Fenrir is... See, Fenrir is interesting because of the fact that it is currently limited to 1. It's not really a great tech option, so I'm just going to put this in bed. It's not really worth it. But in terms of, like, the Kashtira engine, I also think it's pretty bad. You're just better off playing, like, again, other non-engine, right? Board breakers that are actually, like, useful instead of, like, an additional set of bodies. I feel like you're just probably going to break on these cards rather than having something that could be useful in more situations, like a Triple Tactics Talents or a Psyframe, right? Like, for example, Psyframes. I think Psyframes are actually, again, pretty good with minimal space. Having something like a Gamma to be able to stop the opponent, even Delta is pretty decent right now, being able to stop, like, Original Sins or Wanted or something like that is pretty decent. So I think the Psyframes are, again, pretty good with low space for non-engine. Next up, we have Change of Heart. I just don't think it's very good. Being able to steal a monster doesn't really do a whole lot when... those monsters aren't individually as powerful as normal, right? Not like a Baron or a what have you, right? Crossout is... It's either best in slot or definitely... I'm going to put it in strong option. I don't think it's necessary to play in every deck, but if you're playing, like, Snake Eyes or Super Heavy Samurai or Labyrinth... not Super Heavy, because they obviously don't play spells. But, like, if you're playing Labyrinth or... Snake Eyes, it's probably worth it to play, mostly because of the fact that you can also call a potential card from the opponent's deck, like a combo starter or something like that, like Snake Eyes Ash or what have you. But it's also pretty good into any deck that wants to play into Nibiru, because Nibiru is pretty common, so being able to play that is very strong as well. However, it's only at 1, which is sad. Ghost Spell is pretty mid. It's okay, but it's one of the worst options when it comes to hand traps right now. In theory, it seems pretty good, but in practice, it doesn't really interact that favorably with a lot of the graveyard stuff right now. So I think it's just, it's a little too inconsistent. Not inconsistent. It's not, like, as useful. Because the idea isn't to necessarily allow them to get to a point where Ghost Spell is, like, usable, if that makes sense. Lightning Storm is, again, another option that's good with low tech space. So there's that. Winter Cherries just is not really all that great. I'm actually going to put it in mid. Reason being, I think right now you can call something like Promethean Princess, which is very strong. You can call like Hita or what is it, Amblo Whale or stuff like that. That would be pretty common in specifically Snake Eyes. The biggest issue that I have though is finding a deck that would utilize this. Maybe Labyrinth. You could play some cards in Labyrinth in the extra deck for Lab. That would be Winter Cherries targets. So I guess, but it's still not great. Ghost Ogre is also kind of mid. It can kind of be useful in a few situations. Like for example, if you were to pop a Super Heavy Samurai card, I guess. There's a few other cards that it would be useful against, but not a whole lot. Ghost Mourner is... I'm going to put it in a strong option because it is specifically an effect negation. However, I think that there are just better options for you. So, I'm going to put it at the top of mid right now, but I think that there are just better options. While it is technically good because of the fact that it is a negate, and specifically a hand trap negate, that negates the effect of the monster and not just like one of the effects like an Ash Blossom would. It makes it a little bit better, but next up we have Lava Golem. This is also going to be like kaijus and stuff like that. I honestly think that right now they're just not all that great. Yes, being able to like kaiju away a Amblo Whale could be nice. I guess I could talk about the kaijus. I think kaijus are a little bit better because being able to like kaiju away... No, actually kaijus are pretty bad. In fact, both of these are pretty bad. They're not great. I think you just don't want to give your opponent a monster, especially a fire monster. That seems like nonsense. But the kaijus as well aren't really all that great because most of the end board doesn't really do a whole lot. Or at least I should say the like on-field presence isn't going to be interrupted by a single kaiju. Like it may interact with it a little bit here or there, but for the most part, I feel like a lot of the end boards are kind of non-committal when it comes to monsters, right? They're not big monsters. Besides like Super Heavy Samurai. Oh yeah. I guess because of Super Heavy Samurai, it makes it a little bit... But even then, like you're better off playing other board breakers and stuff like that. And I just feel like these aren't all that great right now. Skullmeister's just not great. Skill Drain, obviously, is going to be good if you can play it. If you can play it, it's great. If you can't, don't play it. Same with Ghost Match. Anti-Spell is actually not that great of an option in terms of Floodgates. In theory, it seems pretty good. In practice, it's like, okay. Yes, there are a lot of like power spells and stuff like that, but a lot of it is monster combo centric. So if you yourself are not going to utilize spells, maybe it's okay, and like it's fairly decent. But I feel like it doesn't really interact favorably against like Super Heavy Samurai or Labyrinth or even Snake Eyes to some degree. I guess it hurt like branded a bit, but yeah, for the most part, I feel like it's not great. Droll is a strong option. I don't think it's the best, but I do think it's very good. The problem with Droll is that it's not great paired with a bunch of other cards and a bunch of other hand traps. It's very good as like a blowout card if you need to see it, right? And you definitely should be playing it if you can. So like if you're playing Super Heavy Samurai, you should probably be playing it. If you're playing Labyrinth, it's probably a good option to play. If you're playing Snake Eyes, it's probably a good option, right? But overall, like it's not the greatest, right? Anti-spell, or this is an anti-spell. What is this? Eradicator Epidemic Virus. I think it's fine. I think it's okay. But yeah, outside of Labyrinth, you're probably not playing it. That's more or less it. I see no use for any of these cards right now. Chalice isn't great. It's just one negate. Forbidden Lance is okay, but again, most of the interactions tend to stem from monster effects right now, so having something that protects from spells and traps is kind of mid, and then Book of Moon is more or less useless. So, there you go. Same with Book of Eclipse. They're just not great right now. Next up, we have another Floodgate. Yeah, if you can play it, obviously it's going to be good. If you can't, it's not as good. That simple. Enemy controller is interesting because enemy controller always gets better if you are in specifically a mirror match situation. So having the ability to potentially steal a big monster and utilize it while also potentially dodging an effect is pretty nice. However, I don't think it's that great because it is technically a board breaker, and the board that you would be playing into probably doesn't care about one of their monsters getting stolen. It might, but maybe not. So I'm going to put it in mid. I think it's a decent option and is maybe worth considering, but as of right now, Next up we have Raigeki. Raigeki is kind of interesting because right now it's in a pretty good spot. Being able to board wipe your opponent is pretty nice because it allows you to specifically play into triple tack. So if you Raigeki and then the opponent activates things to, reestablish a board or at least not die, you can then just activate the triple tack and play into that. However, outside of specifically that interaction, I don't think it's all that great. I think it's okay. And if you're specifically playing like board breakers, I think it's pretty good. But again, not a big fan of board breakers. I think it's much better to play things like hand traps. Speaking of which, Super Poly has one exception. As opposed to something like Raigeki, you get a monster on your board, and it's very easy to deal with fire boards in particular. With things like Garura and Mud Dragon being options for you, it makes it very strong overall as an option if you do not have a lot of space for like hand traps, right? Or you're playing like a 60 card version of a deck or something like that, right? For example, Branded right now has a really good ability to utilize that super polymerization. So is it pretty good for them? Of course. It's also good for any other deck that might also be able to like fusion summon, right? So like Shadal, for example. But on top of that, it's probably better to play this than like Imperm if you have no other space for additional hand traps, right? So it's like, yeah, you probably want to play this instead. Snatch Steal is banned in Master Duel. Harpy's Feather Duster is, it's decent. The main reason I want to say it's decent and is a strong option is because of the amount of like Floodgates and stuff like that, and people playing things like that. So in a best of one, it's just like a decent option to throw in there. It's fairly decent against a few decks, but not all that great against some others. I just noticed we don't technically have Max C. Obviously, Max C is at the top, but it's not on this list. I just noticed that, and obviously it'd be best in slot. It's Max C. I feel like I don't need to realistically explain that. So there you go. Mistaken Arrest is not great. Same with Xeon Core. Those are more like side deck cards that are kind of silver bullets for specific strategies. We have the Orb. Orb has a similar purpose to the super polymerization, where it is a good option if you don't really need your normal summon, one, but two, and more importantly, if you don't really have a whole lot of space for like really specific board breakers, or like evenly matches or something like that, right? So for example, like in a deck that requires or like doesn't have as many slots available to it, like a rogue deck or something like that, that maybe doesn't need its normal summon. Having access to Orb is pretty nice. Also, because Snake Eyes specifically ends on like 3 monsters, I think it's okay. Next up we have Twin Twister, which is just not all that great right now. I feel like it's just not really worth it to play a Twin Twister. However, Cosmic, I think, is a fairly decent option. I think it's okay because it deals with a lot of very specific interactions. It deals with the field spell from Snake Eyes. It deals with a few like Labyrinth cards. It deals with Floodgates. It deals with pendulums like the super heavy samurai stuff. So it's okay, but it's not going to like be doing anything crazy. It'll just be okay. This card's kind of mid. The Full Force Virus. Again, in theory, it's like if you can play it, it's fairly decent. If you can resolve it, it's fairly decent against like Snake Eyes and stuff like that. The problem is, other than against Snake Eyes, it's not really all that great. I guess maybe against Super Heavy Samurai it's okay. Yeah, I guess against Super Heavy Samurai it's alright as well. But for the most part, there aren't really a whole lot of decks that can utilize this, besides like Labyrinth. But if it's just that one deck that can really utilize it, then yeah, it's probably not worth it. Dimensional Barrier is for once is just not good. Turns out when all of the monsters are Link monsters, having access to the ability to shut off everything except for Link monsters just isn't really worth it. And Super Heavy Samurai can play around this very easily as well with the Link monsters. You have Labyrinth, which doesn't really care. Branded, I guess Branded it hurts, but you'd also have to play it going first specifically, so it's not really all that great. So yeah, I guess against Branded it'd be nice. But then like every other deck like doesn't care. So there's that. Tikaboo is, yeah, if you could play it, it's great. Ash Blossom is best in slot because of Maxi. That's it. That's like the only reason. This card would not be up here if it were not for Maxi. Maxi existing makes this card best in slot. Yeah, you just kind of have to play it. However, if I were being serious, I probably wouldn't even put it in best in slot if it wasn't for Maxi. Because it's honestly kind of okay right now. And it'd be one of the more easily cuttable cards. Right? Which may seem weird because you're like, well, you're talking about hand traps and you haven't talked about like any of the hand traps. Hand traps are coming up. Don't worry. Pink is it's pretty mid right now, but it's okay. Called by is insane, always. Being able to get full combo is great. So there you go. Herald of the Abyss is pretty bad right now. Imperm, Nibiru, Veiler, Shifter. There you go. Those are the best in slots. Now, obviously, Maxi is a card, so it's also up here. But yeah, genuinely. Let's talk about this, okay? First of all, against Snake Eyes, in particular, you want to have a lot of hand traps. Imperm is great. It is targeted effect negation that doesn't die to Called By, that doesn't die to a myriad of other things, right? Doesn't trigger triple tactics, doesn't trigger thrust or anything like that, right? So it's very good, and it entirely can stop Snake Eyes. However, Veiler does play into all of those other cards, but also basically can stop Snake Eyes by itself. It is probably the best one to do that, so it's very, very, very impactful. Nibiru is also very strong against basically everything that isn't Labyrinth. And I guess Branded, because Branded kind of doesn't really care. But it's very good against Snake Eyes. It's very good against Mathmech, which also is here. It's very good against Super Heavy Samurai. It's good against Mana. It's good against any of those combo decks, right? Infernoble, etc. Right? So anything like that, Nibiru just entirely shuts down. Now, would I suggest like playing 3 Nibiru? Maybe not. It's kind of a brick sometimes. But because of Maxi, you can draw into it more easily. And you definitely should be including this in your deck always. Right? Same thing with like maybe a few effect failures. I'm actually going to put this lower. But it's very strong still. Then, of course, we have Shifter. Shifter, if you can play it, you should probably play it. How many decks right now basically need to utilize the Grave? Snake Eye, Super Heavy Samurai, Infernoble, Labyrinth kind of does. Labyrinth specifically needs to send cards to the graveyard, which is important. And then a bunch of other decks as well that like having the graveyard. So all in all, it's a very strong card, and if you can play it, maybe consider playing it. Phantasme is actually fairly decent if you have low space for tech. Again, main reason, lots of Link monsters right now. Again, Super Heavy Samurai and Snake Eyes in particular are very Link-centric. So being able to like activate Phantasme to draw cards, to potentially draw you into maybe one of your other small engine pieces or non-engine pieces, right? Or more specifically drawing into you more engine so that you can play through more is pretty nice. So all in all, it's fairly decent. Also, putting a body on board is pretty nice as well. And then, of course, this one doesn't exist. So all in all, that is it for this list. And yeah, I think hand traps are probably the strongest options for you. I'm actually going to move Ghost Mourner up here to strong option. But yeah, heavily, I don't want to say heavily invest into like hand traps, but more so I think that hand traps are pretty good in the current metagame. Being able to like stop Super Heavy Samurai, being able to stop Manadimian, being able to stop Snake Eyes, etc. is very nice. Also, things like Ash happen to do very well against like Labyrinth, right? The biggest issue is like Labyrinth and Branded fall victim more so to like board breakers than necessarily hand traps, because a lot of the hand traps don't interact like favorably against them. Like Nibiru doesn't really do as much against like Branded and Lab. Imperm's okay against both of them, but they're not like insane. So like against them, it'd be better to have like an evenly matched or a triple tactics or a super polymerization or something like that. So there you go. But all in all, I still think that's you're better off playing more hand traps than board breakers. But that's just me. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy. If you did, I like us very much, so appreciate it. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.